Our next speaker is Mr. Nick Redfern, who I've known for quite some time, and I've valued my friendship with him and his advice and his ability to write well. And he's helped me and my father both on several of our books and processes, and been on a couple of National Archives trips together for quite some time, as well as Linda Howe and so forth. So we do research together as well. So it's a great pleasure that I keep having Nick back here, and he keeps adding valuable evidence to the field. Nick Redfern is the author of a number of books on UFOs, including A Covert Agenda, The British Government's UFO Top Secrets Exposed, The FBI Files, The FBI UFO Top Secrets Exposed, Cosmic Crashes, The Incredible Story of UFOs That Fell to Earth, and On the Trail of Saucer Spies. Nick has written for I Spy, Military Illustrated, and the London Daily Express newspaper. He also writes a regular column titled A View from a Brit for UFO Magazine, and he has a blog, www.ufomystic.com. How many people have gone to UFO Mystic? Oh, you need to go. Check it out. Bookmark it, ufomystic.com. I like Google Alerts. I set up a Google Alert for like UFOs or a specific case that I'm interested in, and every week or day I get an email about the links and things that have posted. Nick has contributed important data to Dr. Robert Wood's groundbreaking book and forthcoming book, In Search of Alien Viruses. I keep urging him to finish that up, but he hasn't done it yet. He's sort of very busy. And he's made a number of visits to the National Archives, as I mentioned before, with myself and others, in search for official documentation of UFOs. And in that respect, that is how I believe that the cover-up will be broken, is how when our team or some other team pulls compelling evidence out of the National Archives, misfiled data or information, things that's so damning and so compelling, so smoking, that it lights up a real storm. With that introduction, please help me welcome Mr. Nick Redfern.
Thanks. Well, thanks, everybody. As Ryan said, I've been to or spoken at all the crash retrieval conferences since 2003, and when Ryan asked me to speak at this one, I guess the challenge was, after 6 years, what do you speak about that you haven't already spoken about? Certainly there's a lot of crashed UFO stories, a lot of incidents out there, but I think the challenge is keeping it interesting for the audience, not go over old ground, keep it visual, and try and bring something new to the table. And, you know, I thought, well, how about this incident? How about that incident? Certainly, you know, other speakers had done their own perspectives on cases that I thought about doing. And then I thought, well, why don't I do something this time a little bit different? Instead of focusing on a case from, say, Britain, which is what I did the first time I spoke here, or Germany or South America, why not go for kind of like an anniversary case? Something along the lines of a case that's 50 years old this year or 30 years old this year, something like that. And so I began looking through the UFO history, the reports, the law, the literature, and came across a number of stories that would perfectly fit the bill. One of them was Leonard Stringfield's investigation of a 1978 case at Fort Dix, Maryland, which involved the alleged shooting of an alien on the runway and the subsequent retrieval of the body. So it wasn't kind of like a UFO crash, but it was a body retrieval, if you like. And that was 1978, so this year that would be the 30th anniversary, so I thought that would be a good one. Then, of course, there's the famous Aztec incident at New Mexico. And the Aztec case is kind of a controversial one, but I'm going to mention it just briefly because Aztec, New Mexico, UFO crash report 1948 with a large number of bodies supposedly recovered was first mentioned in book-length form, at least, in a book called Behind the Flying Saucers by a man named Frank Scully. And the book's been out of print for years, literally decades. But the good news is that just a couple of months ago, a new edition has been published by Timothy Green Beckley out of New York. And so you can now get the book again in its original formats with original cover and a lot of new updated information concerning new revelations. And there's an interview with me in there about how I sent FOIA requests to the FBI to try and get hold of their files on the Aztec case, only to be told that some of them, and specifically concerning some of the players in the story, are actually still withheld under the terms of the national security concerns 60 years after the incident occurred. Now, Ryan had had a lecture on Aztec, I think, once or twice before, so I thought, well, you know, I'll steer away from that one. 60th anniversary is not really sort of a big thing, I guess. And the other one, which I thought about doing, which was a 50th anniversary case, this was an incident that occurred on the island of Puerto Rico. And I went to Puerto Rico, I've been to Puerto Rico several times on expeditions looking for the chupacabras, this weird vampire, blood-sucking like creature. And on the first occasion I went there in 2004 with a friend of mine, John Downs, who spoke here in 2003, we delved into a case, or we heard a lot of stories, I should say, about a UFO crash incident on the island of Puerto Rico in 1958, which supposedly adversely affected the ecology and even the health of a number of citizens of the island. And we never really got to the bottom of the story, but John has just recently put a new book out called Island of Paradise, which delves into this expedition we went on and tells the story of this crash retrieval, something impacting in the El Yunque rainforest and the military going in there and sealing off the site, kind of like a typical crash retrieval scenario, shall we say. So I figured on doing that one, and maybe that could possibly be one for next year, but I thought, you know, why not try for a big anniversary? And I think, you know, like a lot of people, I figured, well, the UFO subject is very much something of the 1940s onwards. It didn't really occur to me, even as a UFO researcher, to go back before that. And one day I was just going through some books and ran across the Tunguska story, which is this weird incident from Russia where, again, something, or as people believe, impacted in the Tunguska area, but actually didn't. Whatever the thing was, it exploded in the air. So there was that one, and I thought, well, that would make an interesting story. When was it? And it was 1908. So, of course, this year is the 100th anniversary of that incident. And I thought, well, you know, this has got to be the one. If it's a 100th anniversary incident, make it this one. So that's what I'm going to do. And in leading up to doing the research for this particular story, I spoke with various people at conferences and lectures, really to get their views on how much people knew about the Tunguska story. You know, do you know the complete story? Do you know the basics of it? And it was kind of interesting that I think everybody has heard of the Tunguska incident, but when I would speak to people at lectures and conferences, they would often say, in response to my question, oh yeah, that was that thing in Russia a long time ago that knocked all the trees down when something exploded. And most people didn't really know much more than that. It was just sort of fragmentary details. And people, you know, said something crashed into the ground. But as I said, when you look into the case, actually nothing crashed, something exploded in the air. So I thought, well, you know, this might be a good time now to get all the information out there to present the various theories with the emphasis on the UFO angle for Tunguska and see what material evidence we have in hand, what the witnesses said, what the scientific community says, and what the UFO community says about it as well. So that's what I'm going to do for you this afternoon. And I'm going to do something I don't normally like doing at conferences or lectures, and that's reading from notes. But that's primarily because today, more than any other occasion, I'm going to be quoting a lot of witness testimony on this particular incident. And I think this kind of parallels what Don Schmitt was talking about last night when he said that witness testimony is very, very important, and that even with Roswell being 61 years ago now, we're still getting new witness testimony coming through from old timers that are still around, still being sought out, and still willing to speak to us. And of course, with Tunguska 100 years ago, there's just nobody left now. But one of the interesting things about Tunguska, that again a lot of people don't necessarily know or realize, is that a lot of people I spoke with consider that the case, when it happened in 1908, that it just sort of fell into large-scale obscurity and was forgotten about. But that actually isn't the case. It was reported throughout in newspapers throughout Russia at that particular time. It was big news, and it was really didn't fall into obscurity until 10 years or so afterwards, and then just vanished for a little while, and then was brought up again when a number of scientific investigations were undertaken to try and determine what had taken place. So the important thing is that back in 1908, literally days after this incident occurred, not only was there major newspaper coverage, but many of the original witnesses that lived in the little towns and villages surrounding Tunguska were all interviewed very, very extensively. So in the same way that people like Don and Kevin are tracking down people still from Roswell today and getting their testimony, we've actually still got the original first-hand testimony from Tunguska as well. So that's one of the reasons why I'm going to quote from notes, is I want to be able to get across to you the graphic imagery, if you like, and the things that people were speaking about and the things that they saw. Because I guess when you hear the testimony in conjunction with seeing the photographs and the devastation of the area, it sort of really hits home the strength and the enormity of this particular incident. Okay. That is, as you can see, a very early photograph of the impact site, I guess that's a good way of putting it, from Tunguska. And again, as I said, this is one of the things that everybody remembers about Tunguska. You have these trees just laid down like matchsticks, whole swathes of them. And the actual impact area, if you like, where you had nothing but trees just laid out, spread for 50 kilometers. If you just imagine that entire scene for 50 kilometers and, you know, just massive devastation. And basically the story is this, that early on the morning of June the 30th, 1908, numerous people in the region of Tunguska, Russia, and specifically in the hills northwest of Lake Baikal, witnessed what was described as a large column of blue light moving deliberately across the dawn sky. Now, that in itself is interesting, that the light was blue. You know, when we talk about fireballs and things like that in the sky, even things like, you know, if you see a satellite re-entering the atmosphere, it looks like a fireball. You know, this was kind of different in every respect, if you like. Now, approximately 10 minutes later, the sighting was followed by the sound of a massive explosion that literally was followed by something that decimated the area and caused damage quite literally hundreds of miles away from the presumed impact site of whatever it was that had entered the Earth's atmosphere and crashed. Well, the event was captured on seismic equipment, and as far away as Britain and in the United States, both the Smithsonian and the Mount Wilson Observatory actually recorded the impact of the object and the devastation. And one of the most interesting things was there was actually a marked decrease across Europe in sunlight during that particular period, purely because so much dirt, dust, and debris had just been thrown up into the air and just, I won't say blotted the sun out, that's a little bit too extreme, but certainly it affected the sunlight. And as I said, this went on for 12, 13 weeks without fail. Yeah. Okay, for some reason these aren't in order. Okay, I guess I'm going to have to get... Okay, I don't know why that's happened, but that's another photograph taken at the time of the location, just from a different angle. I think that was taken something like 15 miles away from the original photograph, the other photograph. So you can see that the imagery, if you like, is just standard all across the entire area. That's not only, you know, did it cause such widespread damage, you have to realize that the amount of power that is required to make that sort of damage as well. You know, it's not just something very, very small impacting into the ground and, you know, making a 20-foot wide crater or something like that. Now that gives you an indication of precisely where the incident took place. As you can see, you've got the Tunguska event marked by the red dots, and you can see Moscow to the left and the Arctic Ocean and Siberia above. So, you know, you consider where it occurred just quite literally in the vicinity of Siberia. It's a very, very isolated, remote location, small villages, small towns, not a great deal of things going on there, and certainly back in 1908, practically nothing at all going on. But nevertheless, as I said, the story did hit the newspapers primarily because the incident was recorded quite literally all around the world. And this particular story was published on July the 2nd, only 2 days after the incident occurred, in the Sabia newspaper, which covered one particular area near Tunguska. And it states, in the North Karolinsky village, the peasants saw to the northwest, rather high above the horizon, some strangely bright, bluish-white heavenly body, which for 10 minutes moved downwards. The body appeared as a pipe, i.e. a cylinder. Now that in itself, on top of the fact that it was described as like a blue stream in the sky, the witnesses in the original newspaper reports weren't actually talking, as this one demonstrates, about, you know, a column of fire. They're actually talking about a pipe. To me, you know, I wasn't there, so I'm not going to put words in their mouths, but if somebody talks about seeing a pipe in the sky, that sounds like a pretty, I would say, either solid object or something that's sort of clearly delineated, not just some weird smoky form soaring through the atmosphere. And the report continues. The sky was cloudless, only a small dark cloud was observed in the general direction of the bright body. It was hot and dry. As the body neared the ground, it seemed to smudge and then turned into a giant billow of black smoke, and a loud knocking was heard as if large stones were falling. Well, I think something's probably got lost a little bit in the translation there, because I think whatever caused that decimation, if it was just described as a loud knocking, that's probably the understatement of the century. I think a massive explosion rather than just a loud knock is probably a better way of putting it. But all the buildings shook. At the same time, the cloud began emitting flames of uncertain shapes. All villages were stricken with panic and took to the streets. Women cried, thinking it was the end of the world. So as you can see, this is sort of a pretty, I guess, vivid description of what took place. But nevertheless, you know, this is the original testimony, only 48 hours after the incident occurred. And so, you know, I think it's important to get across what people were feeling, the emotion that was going through them, etc. at that time. Now, there's another newspaper report from the same period, the Krasnoyarets newspaper from the same day, which states, at 7:43, the noise akin to a strong wind was heard. Immediately afterwards, a horrific thump sounded, followed by an earthquake which literally shook the buildings. The first thump was followed by a second and then a third. Then the interval between the first and the third thumps were accompanied by an unusual underground rattle, similar to a railway upon which dozens of trains are travelling at the same time. Afterwards, for 5 to 6 minutes, an exact likeness of an artillery fire was heard, 50 to 60 salvos in short, equal intervals, which got progressively weaker. After about 2 minutes, one of the barrages, like cannon firing, but individual, loud and accompanied by tremors, was heard. The sky at the first sight appeared to be clear. There was no wind and no clouds. However, upon closer inspection to the north, where most of the thumps were heard, a kind of ashen cloud was seen near the horizon, which kept getting smaller. So again, we have a second report demonstrating from somebody else's perspective what was going on. And I think that's an important point to make, is that the reports that we're getting from the newspapers covered a whole range of the area, a whole spectrum of towns, villages, right across from Siberia through to Russia. And you know, people were seeing this thing in the sky from their own perspectives. And again, for me at least, the fact that the newspaper story that talked about the witnesses seeing the cylinder, that wasn't the only one. There was another one also that talked about the object looking like a pipe, like a very long, thin, I guess, you know, if you want to get controversial, like almost like a classic 1950s mothership type craft that's been described, you know, time and time again in UFO literature. Now, one of the people who was quoted is a man named Semen Semenov, who was one of the first-hand witnesses to this incident and who was willing to speak on record. And he stated, at breakfast time, I was sitting by the house at Vanavara trading post, which is 65 kilometers south of the explosion, facing north. I suddenly saw that directly to the north, over Onkol's Tunguska Road, the sky split into two and fire appeared high and wide over the forest. The split in the sky grew larger, and the entire northern side was covered with fire. At that moment, I became so hot that I couldn't bear it, as if my shirt was on fire. From the northern side, where the fire was, came strong heat. I wanted to tear off my shirt and throw it down, but then the sky shut closed and a strong thump sounded, and I was thrown a few yards. I lost my senses for a moment, but then my wife ran out and led me to the house. After that, such noise came as if rocks were falling or cannons were firing. The earth shook, and when I was on the ground, I pressed my head down, fearing rocks would smash it. When the sky opened up, hot wind raced between the houses like from cannons, which left traces in the ground like pathways, and it damaged some crops. Later, we saw that many windows were shattered, and in the barn, a part of the iron lock snapped. So, again, a pretty graphic testimony. And I've just got one more for you. This is the testimony of a man named Chukan of the Shanyagir tribe. And this interview was undertaken in 1926, 18 years after the incident. All the others were undertaken at the time in question, and I think, you know, they're obviously going to be the ones that are more reliable. But again, if you see something of this magnitude, I think it's going to stick with you anyway, and, you know, you're going to remember the basics of it. And Chukan stated, "We had a hut by the river with my brother Chekaran. We were sleeping. Suddenly, we were both woken up at the same time. Somebody shoved us. We heard whistling and felt strong wind. Chekaran said, 'Can you hear all those birds flying overhead?' We were both in the hut, couldn't see what was going on outside, and they must have been pretty big birds, I think. Suddenly, I got shoved again, this time so hard I fell into the fire. I got scared. Chekaran got scared too. We started crying out for father, mother, brother, but no one answered. There was no noise beyond the hut. We could hear trees falling down. Chekaran and I got out of our sleeping bags and wanted to run out, but then the thunder struck. This was the first thunder. The earth began to move and rock. Wind hit our hut and knocked it over. My body was pushed down by sticks, but my head was in the clear. Then I saw a wonder. Trees were falling. The branches were on fire. It became mighty bright. How can I say this? As if there was a second sun. My eyes were hurting. I even closed them, and immediately there was a loud thunderclap. This was the second thunder. The morning was sunny. There were no clouds. Our sun was shining brightly as usual, and suddenly there came a second one. Chekaran and I had some difficulty getting out from under the remains of our hut. Then we saw that above, but in a different place, there was another flash, and loud thunder came. This was the third thunder strike. Wind came again, knocking us off our feet, struck against the fallen trees. We looked at the fallen trees, watched the treetops get snapped off, watched the fires. Suddenly, Chekaran yelled, "Look, look up," and pointed with his hand. I looked there and saw another flash, and it made another thunder, but the noise was less than before. This was the fourth strike, like normal thunder. Now I remember well there was also one more thunder strike, but it was small and somewhere far away when the sun goes to sleep. So something strange was going on in the sense that there was either several explosions or possibly, you know, maybe some of them are kind of an echo. We just don't know. But nearly all the witnesses didn't just speak of this one huge explosion. It was like there were follow-on rumbles and sounds that reflected for like 10, 15 seconds. And, you know, as you can tell from the testimony, talking about the trees being on fire and a second sun in the sky, this was a pretty dramatic incident. Yeah. Can somebody Tell me why I can't get the images on the screen in the right order. Hopefully. Okay. That's the Smithsonian, as I said, where the impact of the object was actually tracked, you know, just on the other side of the world. And I won't say you can see Russia from the Smithsonian because you can't, but it was close enough for them to track it at least. I had to get that little dig in. Now, if we move on, after the initial flurry of excitement, if you like, died away, the incident really kind of did then fall into obscurity for a while, and it was only resurrected in 1921, so we're talking like 13 years afterwards, when the Soviet Academy of Sciences which is that building there, decided to look deeper into the case and try and determine what had taken place. So what happened was that in 1921, Leonid Kulik, who was a Russian mineralogist, visited what is known as the Podkamennaya Tunguska River Basin on behalf of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Now, at the time, Kulik concluded that the object that had caused such widespread destruction was a meteorite, and that's actually the theory that, for the most part, the scientific community has continued to support. And as a result, a full-scale expedition began in 1927. Now, interestingly, the Soviet government agreed to fund the expedition on the grounds that if it was a meteorite, then it would have likely deposited a massive amount of iron in the area. And of course, the rewards for possibly recouping all that iron for the Russian economy, you know, would have been pretty valuable, if you like. And so that was really wasn't the scientific approach that they were following. It was more of an economic one of, hey, you know, if we can get our hands on all this iron, then that's going to be good for the Soviet economy and, you know, whatever we want to use this iron for. Well, on arrival at the scene of the presumed meteorite crash, Kulik's team was surprised to find that there was no impact point at all. There was no crater. And again, that's one of the big misconceptions that, you know, if you go to Arizona, Meteor Crater, for example, you have this huge crater in the ground. There actually is nothing like that at Tunguska at all, and there never was. There was just these huge matchstick-like trees just strewn everywhere. Well, instead, there was merely a huge 50-kilometre wide area of flattened and burnt trees. And, you know, in many respects, this sounds like something that you would see at, for example, Nagasaki or Hiroshima in the Second World War. You know, just massive devastation and ground just destroyed. Well, over the course of the next decade, Kulik initiated no less than 3 expeditions to the area. And that's Kulik, as you can see, with his hat, and as you can tell, that's the sort of clothing you need when you're out there. It's a very vicious, desolate weather, worse than England even. And I don't think it rains quite as much, but it gets a lot colder. So, you know, it's one of these, like an arduous task to get out there and actually do investigations. And, you know, they didn't have the benefit of fast-flying jets or anything like that in those days. And a number of the people on the expedition actually died getting there. That's how hazardous and arduous it was for the people. And over the course of the next decade, as I said, Kulik initiated no less than 3 expeditions to the area in an attempt to determine what precisely had taken place. Well, Kulik re-interviewed, I should say, some of the people who'd spoken to the newspapers at that particular time, got their testimony, and again, the interesting thing was that it corroborated the original newspapers. Kulik never tried to you know, put words into the mouths of the witnesses. He basically let them speak for themselves and then went back to the newspaper reports from 15, 20 years before to compare what they'd said and see how it compared today. And of course, you know, there weren't significant differences. There were some little things they'd forgotten, or maybe they got something in the wrong order. But, you know, that's natural. It's kind of like asking anybody in the audience, or even me on stage, you know, tell me what you did last Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. You know, that's a week ago. When you're talking about 18 or 20 years before, that's understandable. But I think, you know, he was mainly impressed by the fact that they were still relating this account as they saw it back then. Well, again, Tunguska, as I said, rose with Kulik's investigation and then collapsed pretty much until the 1950s when it was resurrected once more. And the reason, again, was really economic. What happened was that several expeditions were undertaken to the area, again with the purpose of finding minerals, iron, etc., that could possibly be used by the Soviet government. And when the team arrived at the site, the initial team in the 50s, they found large amounts of both nickel and iridium present at the Tunguska site. Now, both these are found in meteorites. So, you know, that was one of the things that, again, led the scientific community to think, well, this would have to be a meteorite. And interestingly enough, however, further experiments undertaken in the mid-1960s by Russian scientists demonstrated that, in all probability, if it was a meteorite or whatever it was, the object had approached the area at an angle of roughly 30 degrees from the ground. So this, again, reinforced the idea that whatever it was, it hadn't slammed into the ground, it had exploded at this 30-degree angle as it was coming in. Now, of course, the big question was the Tunguska object, device, whatever you want to call it, was it a meteorite, or was it something that could be described in astronomical terms? Was it something more exotic? Those are the big questions that, you know, we need to ask. And the scientific community, for the most part, hasn't really been willing to ask those questions. It's more been that they've denied the more exotic explanations. Now, when I talk about exotic explanations, this includes everything from black holes, an experiment by Nikola Tesla, and of course the UFO angle. And as I'll point out shortly, there's actually a dovetailing, if you like, between the Nikola Tesla story and the UFO story. And this is actually a brand new revelation, which I'm going to discuss with you. And of course, the down-to-earth explanations are meteorites, asteroids, and comets. So if we start with the idea that it was an asteroid, the chief difficulty in the asteroid theory is that if some sort of stony object should have produced a large crater when it struck the ground, but as I said, no crater was ever found. Now, it's been suggested that the passage of the asteroid through the atmosphere would cause temperatures and pressures to build up to a point where the asteroid completely disintegrated in a huge explosion. Now, the destruction would have to be so complete that no remnants at all of the asteroid would be found. And that's pretty hard to believe. You know, if you have an object like that, big enough to cause the devastation at Tunguska, you would imagine that at least something of that would be found in the area, and nothing was. And that actually goes to the meteorite theory as well. Although, as I said, evidence of certain minerals that are found in meteorites were recovered at the area, they weren't found in the form of, you know, giant rocks that didn't resemble anything normally found in the area. So, you know, that sort of begs the question, was the meteorite theory simply accepted because rocks found in the area contained minerals that are found in meteorites? You know, that doesn't necessarily make a connection between the two. It's kind of like a leap of faith almost. But certainly the asteroid theory, as well, as I said, falls down because we're asked to believe that, to accept it, that there wouldn't be anything left of it. It was just completely disintegrated. Now, models published in 1993 suggested that if it had been an asteroid, it would have to be about 60 meters across, which is about 180 feet, getting on for 200 feet. And again, you know, you simply would have some evidence of that left. You know, that's just not out of the question. And Christopher Chyba and others have proposed a process whereby a stony meteorite could have exhibited the behavior of the Tunguska object. Now, their models show that when the forces Supposing a body's descent become greater than the force holding it together, it blows apart. The result is no crater, and damage is distributed over a fairly wide radius, and the damage being blast and thermal heat, etc., which is similar to what happened. But again, you know, we come back to this issue of no debris on the ground. Well, during the 1990s, Italian researchers extracted resin from the cores of the trees in the area of impact to examine trapped particles that were present during the 1908 event. And they found high levels of material commonly found in rocky asteroids, but rarely found in comets. So there are certain things which are against the asteroid theory. Then you have another team suggesting, okay, it could have been an asteroid, but their research ruled out the idea that it was a comet. And of course, the comet theory was another very, very popular one, which I'll come to shortly. Now, moving on to, I suppose, more exotic theories, we have the idea that it was a black hole. And this was proposed in 1973 by Albert Jackson and Michael Ryan, who were physicists at the time at the University of Texas. They offered this theory that Tunguska was caused by a, quote, small, around 1,000 kilograms to 1,019 kilograms black hole. So I guess, you know, if a small black hole can wreak that sort of damage, you know, we want to thank our lucky stars that it wasn't a big one. But the problem with the black hole theory is that the theory behind a black hole, when it strikes a solid body, is that it should pass through the Earth. The hypothesis fails, of course, because there's been no evidence of like a straight line pointer straight through the Earth where something basically came out in simplistic terms on the other side. And the place where it should have come out, considering where this thing came down, was in the Southern Ocean about 10 degrees west of the Drake Passage. So again, this suggests that the black hole theory, as intriguing and as ingenious as it was, doesn't and didn't answer the question of what happened at Tunguska. But nevertheless, it was actually picked up on by quite a few science fiction authors who decided that, you know, this would make a great scenario for a novel. And a guy named Larry Niven, a famous sci-fi author, wrote a book called The Borderland of Sol that used this same scenario. David Brin wrote a novel called Earth, which followed a similar path, and Bill DeSmed in a novel called Singularity. So, you know, Tunguska, I suppose, has helped the sci-fi community as well as the UFO community. That's something I'll delve into shortly as well with the UFO angle. Now, I mentioned also the idea of a comet being responsible. The one person more than any other who, I suppose, championed this theory was a British astronomer named Fred Whipple. And his scenario was that it was a small comet, probably being composed primarily of ice and dust, and which was completely vaporized by the impact with the Earth's atmosphere. You know, obviously heats up, gets hotter and hotter to the point where, when it explodes, that a comet potentially could leave no trace at all. And the comet hypothesis also gained acceptance amongst a number of the Soviet investigators of the Tunguska incident, particularly during the 1960s when it was really in particular favor. In 1978, an astronomer named Lebor Kresak suggested that the body itself that came down at Tunguska was a fragment of the short period comet Encke, which is actually responsible for the Beta Taurid meteor shower, which regularly occurs throughout the Earth's cycle around the Sun. Now, the trajectory of the Tunguska object, if you like, is consistent with what might be expected from a fragment of something like a comet. But again, you know, the question is, how do we reconcile that, for example, with the sightings of this pipe-like object and this blue column that was also described, neither of which are actually characteristic of the classic comet? So again, you know, we're left with questions in that respect. Okay. Okay. Can somebody help me get the main one back on screen?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ryan. Okay, now we come to the UFO angle, which is the one you're all here to talk about, or hear about, I should say. And I wanted to sort of get across to you first, before I go into this, the issue or the fact that these other theories have been put forward, and as plausible as some of them are, and although they, to a degree at least, some of them do have some support, they also have aspects to them that negate those theories as well. There's no satisfactory answer or answers all the questions, if you like, with respect to Tunguska by explaining it as a meteorite or an asteroid or a black hole or a comet. We're still left with black holes, I guess, in the story. But when we come to the issue of UFOs, we have to start with this man on the screen. If I can get him up again. Nikola Tesla. And Tesla was very much a maverick but brilliant scientist who really came up with some radical ideas for all sorts of technology, some of which were implemented and some of which were not implemented. But I mean, he had a lot of ideas and goals for putting fantastic projects into place, which could conceivably have answered a lot of our energy questions today. And I think it's fair to say that many of his beliefs and theories he took to the grave with him. But there is this theory that links Tesla with Tunguska. And you can call it, I guess, a story, a tale, a legend, or facts. And depending on your perspective and depending on whose testimony we take, granted the story is sort of fragmentary, but it is one that's been passed down since the time that Tesla was alive. So it's not something that has just surfaced in the last few years by some whistleblower or word of mouth. It has like a history to the story. And basically the story is this, that one of Tesla's great dreams was the transfer by wireless of energy across great distances, and he envisaged that the possibility, or actually the probability was there, that this could be used as a weapon of war. And in simplistic terms, like a classic death ray, the sort of thing that you would see, in the science fiction films. And he envisaged actually creating something like this and putting it into place, putting it to work. And he believed that at a minimum, this death ray could be projected at a distance of 300 kilometers, which, considering we're talking about experiments and feasibility studies that he was undertaking from roughly 1901 to 1906. This is pretty incredible. We're not talking about something being undertaken today. We're actually more than a century ago. And I think that in itself demonstrates the brilliance of the man, that he was far, far ahead of his time. Well, Tesla built, I guess, like a prototype of what he called his death ray at Wardenclyffe on Long Island. And it has been suggested that he may, in a roundabout way, or direct way, I should say even, have been responsible for Tunguska. And the story is that a friend and colleague and acquaintance of Tesla named Robert Peary, who was like an adventurer and an explorer, was trekking to the North Pole. And Tesla suggested to him it might be a good idea if he looked out for any, quote, unusual activity on the night of June the 30th, which was the night when supposedly Tesla planned to unleash this death ray on the world. Not to cause any trouble or havoc or start war, but just really to see if it would work. Well, according to the story, on the night of June the 30th, Tesla set off his device and aimed it towards the Arctic. And Tesla watched the newspapers, sent telegrams to Peary, but heard nothing about it unusual in the Arctic at all. However, he did hear about the explosion in Tunguska and was reportedly thankful that no one was killed, which is one of those amazing things. You would think with all that devastation, at least someone would be killed, but not a single person was. And he concluded, supposedly, that the death ray device had actually overshot, that it had missed its target in the Arctic and had impacted on Russia instead. And the conclusion of the story was that Tesla supposedly got scared and decided to dismantle the device because he realized the tremendous destruction that it could cause if it fell into the wrong hands. So that is the original story as it relates to Tesla, which of course has nothing directly so far to do with UFOs, until now, that is. In 2003, I wrote a book called Strange Secrets, which was a study of government files on strange phenomena. And everybody knows governments investigate UFOs. We have the documents released through the Freedom of Information Act. But when I used to file a lot of Freedom of Information requests or go to the National Archives, I'd often come across files showing that governments have been involved in different areas of, I guess, quote, weird research as well. For example, I found police files where during the Second World War, the British police force had used dowsers to try and find dead bodies buried under the rubble from German bombers. I got the FBI's file on their investigations into spontaneous human combustion, Royal Air Force files on analysis of supposed film footage of the Loch Ness Monster and all sorts of things. So the book demonstrated that governments have been involved in investigating weird things. One of the things that I found was that the FBI had opened a large file on Tesla, and this extended pretty much right through the 1940s when a lot of his original files were confiscated, and a lot of them have never seen the light of day ever since. Well, I was contacted just recently, March or April, by a guy named Martin Kent, who is writing a book about the life of Tesla. And he said, I've read your Strange Secrets book and saw, you mentioned all these different weird files. Are you aware of the Tesla file? And I said, well, yeah, I am. I said, the only reason I didn't include the Tesla file in the book and all the other files is the book you wouldn't be able to pick the thing up because there are that many files on strange subjects. And I said, I just had to draw the line somewhere as to what I put in and what I didn't. And he said, well, I've been digging into this story at a greater level. And he said that he'd come across some correspondence between Tesla and a colleague of his in 1902, where Tesla was talking about actually having what he described as having a strange dream one night, where he talked about this small dwarf-like creature coming up against the side of his bed, and Tesla not being able to move, feeling paralyzed, almost like a classic alien abduction account. And he talks in the letter about how when he woke up the next day, his mind was just filled with imagery of some of these machines and devices that he wanted to create. And some of them were ideas that he'd had in planning stage before, but he just couldn't grasp the theory and the practical side of them properly. And yet, supposedly, after this weird experience, it kind of became clearer to him. Now, as I said, in many respects, this does sound like a typical alien abduction scenario of somebody having an unusual experience in the middle of the night, seeing a small dwarf-like entity, not being able to move. And there are also a lot of reports within abduction law of people feeling that, I guess, messages or images are being put into their mind. Now, from the letters, which I've had the opportunity to read, he doesn't talk about, this creature had a large bald head and big black eyes. It's not like a classic grey, but it is interesting that it's described as a dwarf-like creature. And he actually describes it as resembling a creature that has become famous, or rather infamous, in other aspects of the Fortean and unexplained world, a creature known as Lam, spelt L-A-M, which was a being supposedly summoned up by none other than Aleister Crowley, which, if you change the eyes on the drawing you can find on the internet and make them a bit bigger, it looks like the classic imagery on the front cover of Whitley Strieber's Communion book. So, we have to wonder that if there is a UFO connection to Tunguska and Tesla was in some way implicated, ironically, maybe an alien spacecraft didn't impact at Tunguska, but is it possible that the technology that could have wrought havoc on the area itself was created by Tesla, but could it have been somehow connected with the dream of this weird creature that supposedly manifested in his bedroom? I don't know, but Martin Kent's digging into it more. Apparently the family of the colleague of the person that Tesla was in touch with has agreed to share all of the diaries and notes. So we may get a clearer picture as time goes on that possibly will shed further light on this whole issue of Tesla's link, this strange midnight experience, and what it might mean for the whole scenario. Okay, now I talked just a few minutes earlier about the issue of science fiction as it's linked to the Tunguska story. This is one of the most famous books that was written on the incident itself, which by Stanislav Lem, a famous sci-fi author, and as you can see, the title translates in English to astronaut. So again, it sort of gives evidence that this is a case that has been presented as science fact and science fiction, and sometimes, or occasionally I should say, there has been a confusion developed over something presented in a fiction book and something presented in a factual work on the case. But that doesn't take away from the undoubted fact that there are very demonstrable oddities and strange aspects to the case. Well, as far as the UFO angle itself was concerned, it primarily was put into place in the late 1970s in a book called The Fire Came By, written by John Baxter and Thomas Atkins. And according to the authors, the magnetic field of the Earth was greatly disturbed at the time of the Tunguska event. And this was in a scenario that strongly supported the idea of not a comet or an asteroid, but some sort of nuclear explosion. Now, what's interesting is that there is actually verifiable evidence suggesting that the explosive effects on the trees in the area near, I guess what you could call ground zero, was actually replicated during atmospheric nuclear tests that the US military undertook in the 50s and 60s. Now, these are effects which are caused by the shockwave of the explosion. And what happened is if you look at all the photographs from the Tunguska site, what you have is that the trees directly below wherever this thing was exploded, they're basically stripped because the explosion went downwards. And then when the impact or the explosion hit the ground, it spread outwards. So the trees directly below it were just sheared and torn apart. And then as the explosion went out, they were pushed outwards. And that is exactly the effect you get if you have an airborne nuclear detonation. Again, a lot of people think if there was ever a third world war and the missiles are flying, the missile explodes when it hits the ground. That isn't the way to get the best explosion. The best way to ensure that the entire area is saturated in radiation and that there's destruction is to blow it up above the city or the military base, and that just decimates it. And that actually is what happened with these trees. So that kind of added weight to the story of Baxter and Atkins. And since then, that really sort of spurred the research community on to delve further into this area that it could have been a UFO. In 2001, Vladimir Rubtsov wrote an article in Fate magazine, and he suggested that there was an atomic angle to this incident as well, and said, the work by the first post-war Tunguska expedition, organised in 1958 by the Committee on Meteorites of the USSR Academy of Sciences, compelled everyone involved in the discussion to agree. The Tunguska space body had in fact exploded in the air and therefore could hardly have been an ordinary meteorite. And he continued, and this is again something significant that suggests a nuclear angle. A rare mutation among the human natives of the region also arose in the 1910s in one of the settlements near the epicenter. According to Dr. N.V. Vasilyev, medico-ecological examination of the state of health of the native inhabitants reveals population genetic effects similar to those observed in the area in question. So again, we have this situation where we have a nuclear angle, if you like, to this particular story. Now, most recently, in August 2004, a Russian expedition to the site, led by a man named Yuri Labvin, was launched and reportedly uncovered what was tantalizingly described in the media as, quote, an extraterrestrial device at the scene of the destruction. Now, at the time of writing, or speaking to you now, the results of that expedition and whatever the nature of this device was or wasn't hasn't been disclosed. So we're kind of still in the dark about that. But for me at least, I find this genetic mutation in the area, this pipe, this blue column of light, the fact that it exploded in the air, the similarities between our atomic explosions tests done in the 50s and 60s is very suggestive that the, quote, official theories or the scientifically accepted ones may not tell the whole story, and they may be totally wide of the mark. And I think also, I'm encouraged by the fact that we have these new revelations possibly coming out on Tesla. And, I think it's all kind of ironic as well that all this new material is coming out 100 years to the year when this all occurred. Whether or not these diaries and notes, whether there was a plan, to release them 100 years after, I've asked that question. And the guy who's writing the book says he's not aware of it, but then, who knows what's going on behind the scenes? Is it something to kind of acclimatise us finally 100 years later to affirm what really took place? So that's kind of where things are at with Tunguska as far as what the astronomical and scientific community thinks versus what the UFO community has also uncovered. So I hope that's kind of given you, I guess, like a quick 40-minute, 45-minute delve into Tunguska and this 100-year-old incident. And if anybody's got any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nick. Well, one thing I may have not told you, but Ed Dames and SciTech, when it was all exciting in the late 80s, did a remote viewing target on Tunguska. And I have this report. It was fairly detailed, but remote viewing is sort of a speculative thing. But it was a biological ET craft that self-destructed was the bottom line on the report.
Yeah, that's the one thing that everybody who's taken the UFO angle has suggested, that that when we talk about something malfunctioning, it didn't crash and cause damage. It's whether it was flying in the air and suddenly malfunctioned, or if it was already malfunctioning when it entered the atmosphere. Yeah. We don't know, but this was something that just like a plane exploding in the sky. That's what happened.
Yeah. Let me take a couple questions and then we'll take a Okay. All right.
Nick, there was an eyewitness account about a course correction of the cylindrical craft. Not a great, I don't know, which indicates that it was under some kind of intelligent control. And two, there was no real radiation ever encountered at the site, as I recall. Is that true?
Yeah, actually, you mentioned this last night about the course change of the object, and I said I was going to mention it, and then I forgot. So but yeah, that's one of the interesting things that occurs, or is mentioned in one of the reports, that several of the witnesses said this thing didn't just fly in a straight line before exploding. It kind of changed direction. Now, of course, a meteorite, an asteroid, a comet, anything like that is not going to change direction in midair. And if it did, it would be the first time in recorded history that it did that. It's just not possible. So if it changed direction, it was under some sort of intelligent control. And if it was crewed, if it was manned, then it was maybe some sort of last valiant attempt to try and prevent destruction. But Norman's quite right that at the crash or the impact site itself, no actual radiation was recovered, but genetic mutations sort of 40, 50 miles away, which were undertaken in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, did show, as I said, evidence of problems in the human population. Now, I guess the bigger problem is that the tests of the area where these mutations were found weren't undertaken for at least half a century after the incident occurred. Now, if this was low-level residual radiation, who knows to what extent it would have remained 60, 70 years later. Who knows what sort of equipment was used to test for it even. Those are unknown factors, I think, to some extent. But
another question over here.
I think it's along the line of what you're just saying. Was there any evidence that any animals were injured? You said there were no human deaths. How did the animal population fare?
Well,
were there any
yeah, there were animal deaths, but they were primarily wild animals like deer and things like that lived in the woods. Now, I do know that in the original expedition that Kulik undertook, there were not autopsies, but studies were done on animal skeletons found in the area. And I know the conclusion was, which was pretty obvious, they were killed by blast effects. But of course, you know, today, if this incident occurred today, we would have like hazmat teams out there doing all sorts of things. You know, 100 years ago, they worked with what they could. You know, I'm sure they weren't thinking about biological viruses or radiation. It was just, oh my God, you know, it's killed all the animals and brought the trees down. But yeah, there was a lot of animals, wild animals killed in the area.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nick.
Alrighty. Thanks. Thanks, Ryan.